The great challenge now is to enlist the cooperation of many nations in preserving peace and in enriching life. This cannot be done by American edict or by the edict of any other nation. It must reflect the concepts and the wishes of the people of those nations themselves. The history of the post-war period teaches that nationalism can be dangerously disruptive or powerfully creative. Our aim is to encourage the creative forms of nationalism, to join as partners where our partnership is appropriate and where it is wanted, but not to let a U.S. presence substitute for independent national effort or infringe on national dignity and national pride. It is not my belief that the way to peace is by giving up our friends or letting down our allies. On the contrary, our aim is to place America's international commitments on a sustainable long-term basis, to encourage local and regional initiatives, to foster national independence and self-sufficiency, and by so doing, to strengthen the total fabric of peace. It would be dishonest, particularly before this sophisticated audience, to pretend that the United States has no national interest of its own or no special concern for its own interests. However, our most fundamental national interest is in maintaining that structure of international stability on which peace depends and which makes orderly progress possible.
That was President Nixon addressing the United Nations on September 18th, 1969. Good evening and welcome to the Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security. I'm your host, Mary Kissel. Thank you for tuning in. We're joined tonight by our co-chairs, Ambassador Robert O'Brien and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and our distinguished seminar members. Our topic: international institutions, their missions, the reality, and how to reform them. Mr. Secretary, I'll start, as I often do, with you, and maybe we'll tackle the United Nations first, since we just saw a video of President Nixon addressing that body. When you look at the UN Charter, it sounds great: to save generations from the scourges of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and dignity and worth of the human person. Let's start with your experience at the United Nations, but maybe start with the mission. Sounds good. Should we support it?
Well, thanks, Mary. You know, it's fascinating to listen to remarks from 1969 from a president who, frankly, wouldn't be associated with America First, and hear him talk directly about America First. And about American national interests and the things we need to get right for our own people. But more than that, as someone who was a practitioner as a Secretary of State and had to interact with that institution, that body, what I implored it to do was to get back to that mission. It wasn't that the mission itself was outdated. I think you could read that mission statement today and be very difficult to disagree with much, at least as the words were originally understood in the immediate aftermath of the war when the charter was created. But if you took that mission set and laid it across the activity set for the United Nations today, man, that Venn diagram didn't have a heck of a lot of overlap. And that's the conundrum that America faces, that you now have a United Nations that has just moved away from its own core mission. So I think maybe I'll stop here. The problem isn't the mission of the United States. It is that the United Nations today, as structured with the Security Council and the General Assembly, as structured today, it no longer is comporting with its own mission statement. And for America, that is deeply problematic and requires a lot of thought and a set of actions that I'm sure we'll talk about here as we move through the evening tonight.
Well, we have a lot of seminar members who have firsthand experience within the walls of the United Nations, so it is going to be an interesting discussion. Ambassador O'Brien, another one of our co-chairs, agree or disagree with the Secretary?
Well, I agree with Mike. It's I've got a fair amount of experience with the UN. I was actually, as a young lawyer, I worked on a committee of the Security Council that dealt with claims against Iraq arising out of the first Gulf War. And that was an example of the UN getting something right. There was a brief, shiny moment in time when, at the end of the Cold War, when we could get things done, and the UN came together and decried the invasion by Iraq and Kuwait, and then set up a compensation commission to assess reparations, essentially, against Iraq for the damage it caused the government of Kuwait and other governments and private companies and individuals. So I've seen it from the inside. I then, during the Bush administration, went back as a U.S. representative of the UN General Assembly, and saw it kind of from the other side as a United States representative at the UN. And I can tell you that having seen it from the inside, both as a representative and as an employee of the Secretariat, there's a lot that needs to be done to fix the UN. But if we didn't have a UN, we'd have to reinvent one. And so it's better that we fight to bring the UN back to its original goals and keep it headquartered in New York, where we've got some additional level of influence over the UN rather than having it in Beijing or Moscow or Paris, for that matter. And we've got to do things like make sure there are enough Americans. One of the things that Secretary Pompeo and I tried to do was make sure the UN hired the requisite number of Americans. There's a quota system for government employees at the UN. And trust me, China makes sure that they get their quota plus more. The Russians do the same. We were 200 under our quota because no one of the U.S. government was putting pressure on the UN to hire Americans. And that's something Secretary Pompeo and I put a lot of time into with Secretary Gutierrez, the UN Secretary General. So, we've got to participate. We've got to win. One thing I'll just mention is the Chinese view the UN as being very important. They've tried to take over the Secretariat, and they've tried to take over many of the elected official positions at the specialized agencies. And what the Chinese do, it's classic Marxist. They go after the legal department and try and become the general counsel, and they go after the human rights or the human resources department so that they can stop any whistleblower or anybody who tries to illuminate what the Chinese are doing at the UN. They can stop them with the lawyers and the HR folks. And so they've captured those departments in many of the UN specialized agencies, and we've got to fight that as well. So, look, it's not ideal, but it has a role, and we need to be there and make sure that American interests are protected at the UN.
Well, we've got a new seminar member tonight, Ambassador Kelly Curry, who was the U.S. representative to the UN's Economic and Social Council and was the alternative rep to the General Assembly. Kelly, welcome to the seminar. I think the Secretary and the Ambassador O'Brien have alluded to several problems, but again, just a scene set here, I'm wondering if you could give our audience a sense of just how vast the UN is, all of the things that it does. And if you want to address anything else that was said, please do. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks for welcoming me. I'm excited to be participating in this very timely and really important topic. I think that it's almost easier to say what the UN isn't involved in at this point than to say what it is, because it's literally managed to try to insinuate itself into every facet of every possible issue, from traffic to, obesity, to you name it. They literally have resolutions on International Day of Three-Toed Ungulates. And if you can tell me what a three-toed ungulate is, then you win a prize. So yeah, that's what we're doing at the UN most days. We have one of the largest missions the United States does at the United Nations, and we could not keep up on a day-to-day basis with what they were doing in terms of managing all of the different committees that were meeting, all the resolutions that were being churned out, and just trying to keep on top of everything that every agency was doing and starting up was near impossible for the United States government. So you can imagine what most governments there that are, we dwarf them in terms of the number of people that we have. And I take Robert's point about us being underrepresented in the Secretariat, but our mission, like I said, is one of the largest, both in New York and in Geneva. And we also deploy substantial personnel in other places where the UN has a presence. And we can't keep up with all the nonsense that they get up to. And I remember I used to say, they have so many nooks and crannies because they're doing so many things that there are just so many little nooks and crannies that they can hide their corruption and get up to no good. And that's basically what was going on. And so I think that one of the things that was our mantra under Ambassador Haley and continued to be my mantra after I moved back to DC and was working for Secretary Pompeo, my boss at the State Department, was back to basics, that we need to get the UN focused on getting back to the charter, getting back to the basics, back to the 3 pillars of human rights, peace and security, and development in ways that were focused, targeted, measurable, and concrete, and not be doing all this nonsense that wasted everybody's time. The problem is that most countries that are represented at the United Nations don't really have any skin in the game. A lot of countries make absolutely no dues payments, or very minimal, only like a literally de minimis dues payment every year. And countries like the United States carry the financial burden, but we are up against a lot of countries that it's like the worst parliament ever, because you have all these countries represented that don't pay for anything, but they just keep ginning up entitlements every session. And so they don't have any accountability, and they don't have to pay for any of the stuff that they create. And so they do it for very, person for their own reasons, for self-reflective and to look like they're accomplishing something. But in the end, they just gunk up the whole thing. And I used to liken it to silting up the channel, that they silt up the channel to where now ships can't get through. And so when you actually need the system to work, it doesn't.
Well, I'm sure we'll come back to you, particularly on the China issue at the UN and corruption. I know that's something that you and others on this seminar team have worked on. And I commend to everybody the work of the late Claudia Rosette, who exposed the Oil for Food program, which was one of the largest public frauds in history, and that was committed under UN auspices. But Nadia Shadlow, you were Deputy National Security Advisor, dealt with the UN as well. Do you agree with Ambassador O'Brien's assertion that if it weren't there, we'd have to invent it? Do we really need it?
No, I think a lot of times I do. Sometimes the way that I put it sometimes is when I'm speaking to a group of students, often if you look at the problem sets that we're dealing with today, whether they're refugee crisis, whether it's climate, whether it's development issues, would you create the same set of institutions today that we have today? It's a little bit unfair. I know it's one of those you can't go back. But if you actually sort of started with a clean slate and look at the problem sets we have, would you recreate the institutions we have today? Maybe in some cases you'd recreate parts of them, but certainly not all of them, like, sort of off track, but the role of capital today. There's a lot of capital out there today. Would you recreate the World Bank and the IMF? Would they function in the same way? Or Kim on the seminar knows, she has experience at Exim Bank. So sort of that's the overall frame. But having said that, we have the institutions that we have. But what did occur to me as Ambassador O'Brien was speaking was the sense of, I don't think we go into organizations like the UN with a UN strategy, right? We actually don't think strategically about how to manage that organization and how to win in that organization. And it's sort of almost improper to say win in the organization, but everyone on this call knows that this is a contest being played out in these organizations. And for the most part, our State Department, no offense, but I know Secretary Pompeo has seen this, and I know Mary has too, doesn't roll up its sleeves and say, how are we going to win at the UN today? I mean, you did, Ambassador Haley did, others did, but not everyone in the bureaucracy does that. So I would step back and say, what are the outcomes that are in the U.S. interest, and to what degree can the UN help us get there? And if so, what's our strategy? and only focus on those issues. And that helps. And, some of Kelly's terms, to get rid of the craziness. We're just not going to even focus on the craziness. It doesn't matter if we're not at the meeting for that creature that you mentioned. I don't know what that creature is. But, we're only going to focus, on the 5 outcomes, the 10 outcomes that the UN can help us get there, maybe help align states to get there, roll up our sleeves and, kind of play the game in the organization that we need to be playing more effectively. And I think the same can be said of several other organizations. And then as we get on, there's several that maybe we just don't need at all, but we can talk about that later.
Well, you said the keyword strategy, and we have a grand strategist on the call, Bridge Colby, who wrote a book, The Strategy of Denial, which I'd also commend everybody on the call. Bridge, if you look at an organization like the United Nations, what are those key priorities? Is it to restructure the Security Council? Is it to finally shape up UN peacekeeping to do good rather than to just pay off the member nations that provide the troops? Is it humanitarian aid? I mean, what are those top line items that we should focus on?
Well, thanks a lot, Mary. You're far too kind and great to be on the panel once again. I thought it was actually pretty interesting what President Nixon was saying about international order, and gets back to, often Kissinger's associated with that kind of rhetoric, and he probably had a hand in that speech. But I think it's interesting that it came directly from President Nixon having a vision. And it's just interesting. I mean, the UN in its earlier days was really designed to be, as I understand it, and others know a lot more than I, a forum for kind of high security politics or sort of, matters of great power, war, and peace. And it's really gotten away from that. I mean, it's been striking. I mean, I remember, I think Robert may have been there at that time, or certainly around that time. And I think Nadia was in the area. But just, the drama at the UN, even as late as 2003, in the run up to the Iraq War, I don't think the UN gets that kind of attention now. I mean, possibly with the possible exception of the narrow issues around Israel, not narrow issues, but around the particular issues around the Palestinians and the Arab-Israeli conflict and so forth. That may be aside, but certainly the abhorring rivalry between the United States and China, it's pretty much absent from the UN agenda and we know why that is for structural reasons. But if I think when people went back to what the core purpose of the UN was, it was the prevention of major power war. I don't know if that's, I'm personally pretty skeptical that it has a good chance. But maybe that's something that could be part of an agenda for real UN reform, because as a number of people were saying, there's so many things the UN's doing, but it's a classic case of organizations like the State Department probably doing so many things and missing out on kind of the core purpose.
Well, there's a great quote from one of President Nixon's books. He wrote, quote, "The 20th century has demolished many myths, but none so more devastatingly than a wishful notion that world organizations could bring about perfect peace." Kim Reed, I want to turn to you, because one of the underlying assumptions of the conversation so far is that the United Nations either does frivolous things, crazy things, or it just gets gucked up and it can't achieve anything. But there's another possibility, which is that it does real harm, like in the World Health Organization. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. And greetings from Zurich, Switzerland. Before I speak, I just want to pause for a moment to say how much I'm enjoying being with our Swiss colleagues here, American Swiss Foundation Inaugural Leadership Summit. And we're saying goodbye this year to a good friend of Switzerland to the United States, Ambassador Jacques Pitelou. And he sends his regards to everyone. And he's done a great job in the United States, helping us, as Ambassador O'Brien knows, with a very important topic, bringing our hostages home, and how we work with Switzerland on that. And I asked Ambassador Pitelou directly this evening about the topic we'd be discussing today. I wanted his Swiss perspective on this. And he believes the United Nations should be saved, but it should be recreated in the way that America first created it. So just wanted to share that. And also, we heard from Harold Hamm and Secretary Pompeo. I got Harold Hamm's book, and you wrote the introduction to our 50-year mission to secure America's energy independence. So just sending greetings from Zurich, 2 a.m. And Mary, before leading the Export-Import Bank of the United States, I was president of the International Food Information Council Foundation, where we focus on communicating the science on food safety, nutrition, and health. And so I was extremely engaged with a part of the UN, the World Health Organization, as well as FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. And I would attend something called the World Health Assembly every year as a civil society delegate, where we watched all the countries that are member states participate and decide what should be on the agenda and how those things are taken up. And I also testified before the UN at a special high-level meeting on non-communicable disease, such as cancer, diabetes, heart disease. And my observations included sending comments to WHO for consideration. There needs to be more transparency of what's going on. They call for conflicts of interest checks on industry's involvement in issues that require industry's involvement. Yet what I witnessed many years in a row were how activists would lead countries around and tell them what to do and how to vote and what to think. And they, I would say, had extreme disregard for the United States and our science-based focus and what our government was trying to do, let alone the dues that we pay to these organizations.
Gosh, Kim, I mean, what a great point. I remember many years ago, those same activists lobbied countries to degrade our intellectual property protections. And they convinced Thailand to violate the patents of several major pharmaceutical companies. So you're right. But, you know, when we say WHO, I think Wuhan lab and the cover-up that the WHO engaged in when COVID broke out.
At this conference I'm at right now, our former U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams is here, and he was our U.S. Surgeon General during COVID, and he's come out with a new book. And he said, because of WHO's inaction, as we all know, on China, we've lost millions of lives that unnecessary. And we really need to hold these organizations accountable. We need to do a complete rethink. And it's just very frustrating to me. A colleague of mine, Dr. Jack Chow, who was the U.S. ambassador for global HIV and AIDS during the Bush administration, who's taught me a lot about WHO, he wrote a piece in Foreign Policy, Is WHO Becoming Irrelevant? And this was back in 2010, before we had COVID. But one thing that he pointed out that we've already discussed is we really also need to take a look at the personnel system of these organizations. And we need experts in places like WHO and in all parts of the UN, but there are linguistic requirements, geographic requirements, and where do these experts end up going? Not to this institution. They go elsewhere because of the archaic system. And it's just very frustrating. So I'm looking forward, hopefully, to a complete rethink on this. And speaking of Israel, do we remember what the UN felt when President Trump asked to move or said that we're moving our embassy to Jerusalem? Do we remember how they behaved?
Not well.
So it's time for complete rethink.
Time for a complete rethink. Well, we've got many comments going on the live stream. So thank you to viewers out there for sending in your questions. I'll try to work in as many as I can. But Nadia Shadlow, you had a quick response and addition to what Kim said. Over to you.
Just a quick point on the WHO, which I discovered and might be of interest to listeners. If you go back and look at what happened and unfolded during the first SARS epidemic, it's really actually pretty amazing. You can go back to some of the documents, and if you sort of whited out the pandemic, you wouldn't know in some ways the difference of sort of the early ways in which the WHO handled it and the lack of information, lack of transparency, many of the same concerns. It was shocking to me. And I still haven't really seen that kind of comparative assessment. So it's worth looking at and worth someone writing about.
Secretary Pompeo, you were obviously deeply involved in the response to COVID, the outreach, not just to the UN, but to the Chinese government. How do you see the UN's role in really the devastation that COVID wreaked upon the global economy and on human lives?
Oh, goodness, Mary, you're trying to get me wound up. You know, the reality that we experienced was the current leader of the World Health Organization completely in the pocket of Xi Jinping. There's no other way to describe it observationally. We saw it not only from his public statements, but we saw it from the actions of the World Health Organization. If one was counting on the WHO to stop the next pandemic, you should not feel good about that, because they are unlikely to achieve that because they have become so deeply politicized. I've said this publicly before. If you go back and look at how he was elected, you can clearly see that there was no option for him in the moment of peril. He was completely beholden for his job to the Chinese Communist Party. And so there was little doubt about how he was going to behave in the moment. And we saw it and we witnessed that. And the result of that was, I'm guessing Xi Jinping would have done about the same thing he did. But man, the public pressure that was relieved by having the WHO essentially grant him a free pass for the first year was of enormous value to the Chinese Communist Party and is enormous damage to citizens of the world. And then, the other thing that I observed was when they were called out for that, they suggested somehow we were racist. Right. So you don't like someone who's from Africa. You don't like the Chinese. Right. Instead of just accepting the reality, this was an enormous failure of the World Health Organization. And so I don't put a great deal. By the way, you'll remember the Trump administration did attempt to hold the WHO accountable. We withdrew. We withheld monies from the WHO, our funding for the WHO. We had our envoy there raising Cain as best he could about how they had behaved, the process failures of the WHO, only to be ended within a handful of hours of the new administration coming in. So I don't think we should think I guess I mentioned that not to be political, but to say the United States has the capacity to shape and influence international institutions, but you have to be prepared to lean into it, and you have to be prepared to go work it and compete. I'll tell one other quick story. I remember one day I came in and the Undersecretary for Political Affairs told me, hey, sir, next week there's going to be an election, 2 weeks off. There's going to be an election for the World International Property Organization. Mary, you would remember this. I was, what's a polite word? I was unhappy.
Quite unhappy.
I was quite unhappy. And so I called in the team and said, that's not going to happen. We're going to go win this election. We're going to go take this thing down. The Chinese candidate was going to win. And I think everybody in the room thought, yeah, we should, but there's no way we can pull it off. And we built a really good team out, and we started calling every country in the world. We tasked it out. We started just rolling. We found a candidate that was above the bar, above the threshold for us, and we started just applying American power in the finest tradition to this. We showed up with a team on election day there of about 11 or 12, and we thought, oh my gosh, that's like way too many people. We're sending 11 people to this stupid thing. The Chinese had about 70, but we beat them. We beat them. We got our person, the person we wanted, elected, and I hope that person has now executed against the mission set that we had lined out for that person. You have to be prepared to go fight and win these institutions. They are not noble and good because they are global institutions. They are important to America when they shape and are reflected by what it is America's trying to achieve inside these institutions. That's not selfish. That's just good governance by American leaders.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We have a question from a viewer. What benefit does the U.S. gain from membership in the UN? Well, you've just given one of the answers. When you have the UN shaping international practices or norms or intellectual property rights rules, shaping institutions like that so that they promote a free world order is certainly in our interest. Ambassador Curry, you wanted to jump in. Over to you. And don't rest, Alex Wong. I'm coming to you next. I want to get you on the Security Council. Kelly.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. With these standard setting bodies, it is important that the United States is present, that we're active, that we send our best into those. That has not historically been the case. In fact, I think we tend to ignore the technical bodies in favor of some of the sexier things like the Security Council, which unfortunately has been hopelessly deadlocked for about a decade now when it comes to major issues of international peace and security, and has really unfortunately just not been very useful. But I think that what to follow up on what Secretary Pompeo was saying, I think that it's really, if you look and go back to what Nadia was saying, after the SARS pandemic, the World Health Assembly and the WHO reconstituted all of the international health regulations in order to avoid a repeat of that situation. But what happened in 2019 and 2020 was the Chinese Communist Party and the WHO under Tedros just ignored all the IHRs because there was no enforcement mechanism. There was no accountability behind them. And it showed that this was all just farce, that it didn't actually, at the end of the day, mean anything. And if you set standards and if you set up rules for the road, but there's no enforcement mechanism when somebody violates them, and we see this with Ukraine, right? With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if they're able to do this, to invade a sovereign UN member state, and there's no consequences across the UN system, then these rules don't mean anything. So not only Secretary Pompeo is 100% right on the things that matter to us, where we have vital national interests at stake. We have to be in there. We have to be prepared to fight and devote the resources to actually make a difference in terms of getting our message across and getting our interests protected. But we also have to be prepared to walk away when the deck is so stacked or the system has become so corrupted and so unfit for purpose that there's no point. You're just like putting good money after bad, and we can't give in to these sunk cost fallacies that we can fix things that are not fixable. And so I think it's a really tough thing for us to do because we're Americans and we always think we can fix it if we apply our if we just work hard enough or apply our American ingenuity. But some of the stuff just may not be fixable at this point, and we have to have some hard conversations with ourselves about that.
Yeah, we certainly do. And by the way, when the Australians called for accountability, Beijing basically enforced consequences on them. So consequences are coming in the wrong direction. Alex Wong, jump in.
Yeah, I want to make an observation here just to level set. I think there's well-founded skepticism of the UN system within the United States among the general population. That's understandable, given all the scandals, given how much money and resources we put there, given, I'm from New York, so there's a lot of animosity among the New York population when the UN, the UNGA happens and it shuts down the city, and the unpaid parking tickets by various perm reps. But I want to say we should recognize that the UN is a prestige organization among many other nations, and not just small nations, but partners like Japan and others that really do value the soft power, the magnification of their power and reputation that come from being a participant in the UN, that come from being a member, a rotating member of the Security Council, taking up the President's Security Council, for instance. And because there is that prestige aspect among other nations, that gives us the opportunity, if we use our power right within the United Nations, to rally these countries, get them on our side, and have coordinating effect among like-mindeds, or at least binding effect, whether it's a UN Security Council resolution. So an example, one of the successes of the Trump administration were the very severe and binding UN resolutions of sanctions on North Korea, which in my job, trying to enforce those sanctions to pressure Kim Jong-un, were actually extremely useful and were extremely persuasive, not just cudgel, but a kind of a moral calling to many of these nations to isolate North Korea, develop our leverage, implement sanctions, and shame even great powers like Russia and China, which did feel some obligation, at least politically, among the Group of 77 or the quote unquote global South, to at least mouth and take some action on sanctions implementation. But to get that kind of good effect, to take advantage of that aspect of the UN, I want to go back to something that Kelly said, that this is not really foreign policy. This is an unruly parliament. And when it's a parliament, you have to play hardball politics. You have to lobby. You have to count votes. You have to have a whip operation. And I don't think it's a coincidence that some of the most successful operators of the UN, the Secretary Pompeo being here and Ambassador Haley, were actually legislators before. They had worked in parliaments. They understood that that's how you operate in the United Nations systems. It's not classic diplomacy. And that's a realization I think we have to to internalize more in our career foreign service, that we just have to internalize more in the United States government. That this is hardball politics in Turtle Bay to get effects and advance interests that we have and use the UN to advance our interests.
This is hardball politics. Quite an observation. Ambassador O'Brien, I want to get to a question from a viewer that concerns the Security Council. When will the Security Council get rid of veto power? And why is it not a majority vote? Is this an example, for instance, of one of those places that could be more effective, to Alex's point, used for good if it were restructured?
Well, we get outvoted all the time in the Security Council, so having the veto is really critical for us and for our allies like Israel that rely on our veto, being able to stand athwart the UN and say, no, we're not going to go with one of these crazy plans and protect our national interests and national interests of our allies. So I don't think it would be a good idea to get rid of the veto, but I do think it's a good idea that we do what Alex said and do what Secretary Pompeo did on the WIPO election, and that's use our power at the UN to get the results we want. The Chinese showed how effective it could be because they captured the WHO, and they captured an institution that allowed them to have the biggest cover-up of a natural disaster or man-made disaster since Chernobyl. And they use the UN system to cover up their bad acts. And so, look, we've got a huge leverage at the end, and that leverage is money. The U.S. pays about 27% of the budget of the UN. Without that money, all the perks, the free gas, the tax credits, the nice housing, the kids going to school at U.S. universities and foreign universities, I mean, everything that the UN, where all the corruption comes from, is money-based. And we control the money. The Chinese have been brilliant because they've captured so many of these institutions, but they've done it without putting any money into the UN because they come at a developing country and they pay about 2%. They've got the second biggest economy in the world, and they pay almost nothing into the UN system. And so we've got to take our money that we've got and start make our contributions to the UN voluntary to support the programs that work for us. And if a program doesn't work for us, and I don't care how popular it is or how noble others think it is, if it doesn't work for us, we shouldn't pay into it. And that lever will give us tremendous hard power in the wheeling and dealing process that Alex referred to and that you and Mike engaged in on the WIPO election, just for an example. So we've got to use the dollars that we put into the UN. We're basically funding the whole thing, and use those dollars wisely, choke off the corruption and choke off the anti-Semites and choke off the anti-Americans where we can, and invest in programs that actually work. Like the International Postal Union. It's pretty cool. You can take a letter and write a letter and it ends up in the Congo and gets delivered, hopefully. Or that you can pick up the phone and dial a country code number and get connected to an overseas destination. So there are things that work at the UN, but and that's where we ought to concentrate our funding on. And where it doesn't work or where it's been corrupted and captured by the Chinese communists, we ought to cut them off.
Well, speaking of that, just to give the current administration their due, I believe they did win an election for the International Telecommunications Union, which, like the World Intellectual Property Organization, sets standards. It's a very important UN body. I want to dig just a little deeper into the politics and the hardball that happens. And Ambassador Curry, I'm going to put you again on the spot a little bit with a bit of current events. And part of the reason why we're doing this seminar is because this really gained international attention, and that was the abstention of the United States in the Security Council on something called Resolution 2728, which called for a ceasefire in Israel. There seem to be 2 points of view on these resolutions. One, that they just don't mean anything, so who cares? And the other side that says, actually, no, this is very meaningful. It's a big change in U.S. policy. We should care a lot. Where do you come down?
Most of the stuff that the General Assembly does, you have to distinguish between the General Assembly and the Security Council. Most of the stuff the General Assembly does is basically nonsense. But when the Security Council acts, that is the closest thing you get to black letter international law. And I'm a lawyer, so I talk about things like black letter law. But when the Security Council acts, it is meant to be like more or less binding on the international system. The problem with the U.S. abstention on this resolution is that, as I guess it was Secretary Pompeo mentioned, or no, it was Robert mentioned, we veto stuff all the time because it's not in our interest. And, a lot of it is about free rider stuff that, literally the veto is the only thing that keeps the worst stuff from happening. But a lot of it is to deal with the incredible and intense anti-Israel sentiment that pervades not just the membership of the United Nations, but also the Secretariat, the operational part of the United Nations. The United Nations itself is an intensely anti-Israeli and I would characterize some of it driven by anti-Semitism organization, and the bias against Israel that is inherent in everything that the United Nations does is so extreme that it almost has to be seen to be believed. It can be breathtaking, and so for the United States to abstain on this resolution this happened before under the Obama administration when Samantha Power was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. So it doesn't shock me particularly that this administration has done it again, but they think that they're being cute and clever because they believe that they got certain language out of the resolution they got rid of the worst aspects of it. But the headline is the headline, and they don't seem to understand how damaging it is for them to do this and how it damages the United States as an ally to Israel, how it damages Israel, and how it empowers the worst elements of the United Nations and the worst actors in the system, both at the country member state level and within the Secretariat.
I just want to put some numbers on what Ambassador Curry just said. Last year, there were 15 UN General Assembly resolutions against Israel, and there were 7 against the rest of the world. And this is a world that includes communist China, totalitarian North Korea, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the world's largest state sponsor of terror. So just to put some numbers on that. I do want to talk about other international institutions other than the UN, but this is such a rich topic. Bridge Colby, reactions to what you've heard so far on the UN.
Well, I think it's a major issue, and it is unfortunate that I certainly don't support the administration's decision to abstain on the Security Council resolution. I mean, I think looking at that issue where the UN does have a significant role for some of the reasons that Alex was pointing out in terms of international prestige and Israel being a relatively small country and so forth. Look, I think it's a very difficult situation in Gaza. Obviously, there's an immense amount of human suffering, but Hamas attacked. And it seems to me that, despite the pressure from the Biden administration, that there's pretty much, I don't know if it's unanimity, but there's a pretty broad consensus across the Israeli political spectrum that they need to go in and, you're never going to get the last Hamas guy, but pretty much decisively defeat Hamas. And, I think if we're in for a penny and for a pound, we can, of course, encourage Israel to respect, the humanitarian considerations. But I think it's pretty clear there is no easy solution, and Hamas has made sure of that. And this is an area where, if the UN, I think for many Americans, certainly Americans more on the right, if there was going to be a hope for a reinvigorated sort of respect for the United Nations, you go back, it's almost touching, the confidence that people had in, the UN Secretaries General in, say, the 1950s. If you go back and you see histories from that time or something, I don't think this is going to do a lot to drive support up. And I think, to Alex's point, I've also seen that the Russians have vetoed actions against the North Koreans. So if anything, frankly, the UN seems to be moving in the wrong direction. I fully subscribe to the idea that you got to compete. And, to me, it's probably going to be, looking at it kind of more from a realist lens, it's going to be a forum for competition rather than resolve it. There may be areas where there is genuine, people generally presumably have a common interest in country code, being able to, or send a letter But where there are differences of interest, and I think those are going to become more intense, I think we're likely to see it. I mean, for instance, the Guyana issue, we're not going to see much going on there. So I'm not super optimistic, but I think we have to play. Unfortunately, that's the reality. If we're absent, we're not going to benefit.
Well, ironically, one of the good things the UN has done in recent years was the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea. They've also, I know, Ambassador Curry, you worked with the folks in Geneva to raise awareness about the Uyghurs or to advocate for Taiwan so that the Taiwanese could at least enter the doors. They're barred from entering the UN compound on the East River, which is just absolutely shocking, given the original signatories of the UN Charter, I believe, were not from communist China. I do want to turn the conversation briefly to some other international organizations. We've got an election for the NATO Secretary General coming up. Ambassador O'Brien, is NATO one of those functioning international institutions? I mean, its very mission, just to go back to where we started, it refers to the UN Charter. It says that we reaffirm these principles and the desire to, quote, live in peace with all peoples and all governments. Does NATO work? Does anything there need fixing?
Well, I think NATO works. I've said this in the past, that NATO is probably the most effective alliance since the Romans had their Latian allies in the wars against Hannibal. So, look, we won the Cold War with NATO. I know Mike served on the border with Eastern Europe. I was there back in the bad old days and went through Checkpoint Charlie and went into East Germany and saw how terrible things were. And we've got a reunified, peaceful, for the most part, Western Europe. And where NATO standing strong against the Russians and Ukraine and other places. So I think it works, but the question is, how do we make it work for the 21st century? How do we make it work for American interests now? And one of the things that we did, one of my favorite pictures from my time in government is a picture of Mike and myself and the president at the NATO summit in London in 2019, where we really went and twisted arms and we got the number of NATO countries meeting their funding commitment for defense spending at 2% of the GDP, up from 4 to 11. I think we're up to even to about 18 now. So it was very hardball diplomacy. We were called anti-NATO. We were called anti-European. But what we actually did was we helped them help themselves. And because of that increased defense spending, they've been able to give surplus supplies to Ukraine and stand taller against Russia. So, look, NATO can't be an American project. It has to be a true alliance where our partners participate, where they spend money on their own defense, and where they're prepared to make hard decisions. And look, I think we're going to have to see NATO get involved in the Asia-Pacific region. That we're going to have to drag in there kicking and screaming. Fortunately, the French have interest in the Indo-Pacific, and the British do as well with some of the islands. And we'll some of their defense treaties with Singapore and Australia and New Zealand. So, I think there's an opportunity for NATO to be more effective than it has been. But I think overall, and history has shown NATO to be a very effective alliance. We shouldn't walk away from it. We should make it better. And unlike the UN, where we're dealing with countries that hate us and hate Israel and hate our way of life, generally with NATO, we're dealing with countries that are like-minded, that believe in the rule of law and believe in democracy and human rights and are our closest allies. So we just need to make it work better. But I think it's an effective alliance.
Well, just to put some numbers on that, and this is from NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg, last year was the 9th consecutive year of increased defense investment across Europe and Canada, with defense spending rising by an unprecedented 11%. With all
thanks, President Trump. When everyone talks about Biden, bringing America back, America came back when we strengthened the alliance, and that goes directly to the hard-nosed diplomacy that our State Department and DOD and the White House engaged in those critical days that put us in that position that Jens is talking about. And he was our partner in that. He was, I think he appreciated it. He had to be careful about what he said, but I think he appreciated the pressure that President Trump brought on our European allies to do the right thing. And trust me, it wasn't easy, especially with the Germans. So,
but we do love our German allies, we hasten to say, or most of us. I wanted to just address an implicit question, which is, if these institutions that we've inherited, like the United Nations and all of its various affiliates, don't work well, if there's silt in that channel, as Ambassador Curry put it, then is it time for voluntary international organizations, things like the Quad, which is India, Japan, the United States, and Australia, or AUKUS, Australia, the U.S., and the U.K.? Secretary Pompeo, is that a better model for getting things done? I know that you also convened a group of like-minded countries to address some problems that we faced in the world as well. What are your thoughts on those kinds of international groupings?
Mary, I'm convinced that they will often lead to better outcomes, not only for America, but for the world. Call them bespoke solutions for particular problem sets. So problem sets in Asia and the Pacific require a bespoke institution or a grouping of nations that share overlapping interests sufficiently that they're prepared to work together on them. You mentioned in your opening, we haven't talked about UN peacekeeping. Bit of an oxymoron for me, a little hard for me to get out in the same sentence. But nonetheless, I did it. No one comes to it. It doesn't come to those of us tasked with trying to build peace to say, you know what I think we should do? I think we should create one more UN peacekeeping mission. It's literally number 17 on the list of things one ought to do, because they have, I think this is fair to say, they have epically failed in almost every instance in which they have been deployed, because they immediately become co-opted at best or corrupted at worst. We continued some of them in the Trump administration. As I look back on underwriting them, as I look back on it, I'm not convinced we shouldn't have ripped the Band-Aid off of some of these. Once they're in place, it's very hard to do. It's because, everybody's screaming, no, it's better than the alternative. In many cases, it's not. And this really gets to your point, I think, which is we often default to the institutions that exist because they exist. But, I encountered, no one's mentioned this tonight, the leader of the UN today is a Portuguese socialist. We should just all acknowledge that, and we should set our expectations accordingly. And so we should not, the United States in particular, should not be fearful of saying, this isn't working. We're going to do our best to make it better. But meanwhile, we're actually going to go deliver for America. We're going to go solve this problem set in a way that is bespoke and capable of actually delivering over a relevant time period a really good outcome for the American people. So if for a moment it's overlapping, I give you PEPFAR as an example, right? So you've got this thing and you'd say, boy, the WHO ought to just be they had not hadn't a prayer of solving that or addressing it adequately. It took American power, American innovation, American creativity. And we should, I think, more often say, we're going to withhold our funds for this. This isn't working. When you all figure it out, we'll help you do that. But in the meantime, we're going to go apply our resources against a solution that increases the probability of a good outcome for the American people. We did some of that in the Trump administration. I wish we had done more. I am hopeful that in a next administration, that team will choose to head down that path more frequently and perhaps take a few more risks at angering some institutional historical biases that just aren't working.
Great points all. PEPFAR, of course, was the U.S. president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. It was the George W. Bush administration, and many consider it one of the most successful public health programs in history, saved millions and millions of African lives, and is present in more than 50 countries around the world, just to give those folks their due. Secretary Pompeo, when you talked about bespoke solutions, it also raised the economic and trade organizations. Of course, Kim Reed, you were head of the Export-Import Bank. And it raises another problem that we have, which is in institutions like, for instance, the World Trade Organization, when you have one of the biggest members breaking all of the rules, in this case, Communist China, what do you do? Can you really fix that? And, Kim, I think it's just such a tough question. Are we on the right track doing things like, revamping and reimagining the USMCA, the old NAFTA, or doing bilateral trade deals? Is that the way forward to enhance trade with our friends?
I think so. And I know that Ambassador, U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer has come out with a book that I recommend everyone read on this. But if the system isn't working, we need to have processes in place that work for America. And I think that we will be seeing more bilateral agreements going forward.
Yeah, it's certainly been a challenge across administrations, not a partisan issue even necessarily, because I think the Biden team has adopted many of the same trade practices as the Trump team did. And I'm not suggesting it's an easy question to crack, but if China continues to break all of the rules, what do we do? What are the mechanisms that we can put into place? Bridge Colby, you've been silent for a moment, which we absolutely can't allow, and I'm conscious that we've only got 6 minutes left in the program. Are there any other international organizations, be it in the economic sphere or the military sphere, or regional organizations like, for instance, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that have good qualities, that have practices that we should adopt and or take into account as we reimagine our participation in these groupings?
Well, thanks, Mary. I guess maybe just kind of on that point, I'll say I think that having a kind of plasticity, you mentioned the Quad, AUKUS, I think both have their pluses and minuses, but having a more flexible approach and not trying to solve all the problems, not trying to, like, I'm not a huge fan of creating an Asian NATO, for instance. I think we should be more sensitive and kind of have this sort of, it's famously the Olin Foundation the founder was a conservative guy, and I'm sure Nadia is very familiar. And he said, these institutions all turn liberal if you let them keep going. So he said there was going to be a sunset clause. So I thought that's kind of, just having that kind of flexibility and plasticity in there, I think is very valuable. Just on the issue of NATO, I mean, I'm a believer in NATO. I think it's been tremendously successful, but I think it's got to adapt to be sustainable. And I think that the Europeans are finally kind of getting the memo, like maybe for real now. I wish they'd gotten the memo 6-7 years ago. They sort of got it. The increases in defense spending are encouraging, but they're behind the curve compared to the Russian militarization. The Russians are a very serious threat, especially in the East. They're remilitarizing their economy. They're going to have a battle-hardened military. And the United States military, I mean, I don't know if you saw, but I mean, a bunch of reports, the Biden administration's only increasing the defense budget by 1%. They're only asking for one submarine. Multiple ship programs are behind budget. I mean, Ambassador Bryan knows this stuff cold. But we're not where we need to be. Hopefully, if there's a Republican President Trump in office next year, you can start to rectify that, but the downward pressure on defense budget is going to be significant. I think we need to move, and I think President Nixon, certainly President Eisenhower, are a big fan, more to kind of a partnership model of our alliances, and Israel's a model here. India, countries like South Korea, is where they really take. But I think getting that into NATO, especially, and moving away from really what's a post-Cold War. I mean, Secretary Pompeo obviously served with distinction on the inter-German border. At that time, I remember talking to an Army general I worked with in the Pentagon. The Bundeswehr was, I mean, in some ways, maybe the most formidable military in Europe, other than on our side, other than our own, maybe, although even there it was competitive. And so this is not something the Europeans can't do. They can do it. We just need to just get going, get practical, and then we can have it, sort of as things will have to change to stay the same. That's my view.
I like to try to end on a positive note. And you raise another interesting question. Maybe I should have asked this at the beginning, but quick answer here from Ambassador Curry. And then I want to go to our co-chairs and then we'll close. Are there partner nations, Ambassador Curry, that help us that don't get attention? Bridge referenced India, South Korea, I believe. Britain's an obvious partner, Australia is. But in your experience, are there other nations out there that deserve a shout out that do partner with us today?
Yeah, I think that some of our most consistent allies are some of the smallest countries in the world, our Pacific Island nations, which have tiny populations, but they get the same vote as us and China and Indonesia or India and big countries in the United Nations. And they consistently align with us. We work really closely with them, and they don't ask a lot from us. And we really struggle to deliver even the minimal things that they ask for. So for me, it seems like a no-brainer that instead of dumping good money after bad in some of these organizations that don't serve our purposes, that we need to really focus on privileging our relationships with the countries that are there for us, like these Pacific countries that are strategically absolutely important for us. I mean, we really need to shore up our relationships. China is all over these countries and coming in and meeting whatever requests their leaders have. And we can barely get our COFA agreements in place with some of our closest allies. And we've got to do better. We've got to be a better ally to the countries that are good allies to us. And if we learn anything from any of this,
the countries us, we are coming up on our deadline. 30 seconds. Final thoughts from you, Ambassador.
That's it. We've got to be better ally to the countries that are good allies to us.
Ambassador O'Brien, final thoughts. 30 seconds.
Well, look, the American people want change, and they want to win at the UN and other international organizations. We need a team of policy experts and diplomats. And I just tell people, look at this seminar, Mary, yourself, and Kelly, and Kim, and Alex, and Bridge, and Nadia. I mean, I don't know what Mike and I will be doing, but you guys are the future of this country. And talk about the hard-nosed diplomacy compared to what we're seeing now with American weakness. If we want to get back to peace or strength, we need to have the personnel that exemplify peace or strength, and the folks on this seminar and that have participated in the past, the Mike Waltzes and Gallagher's and Alex Gray's and others, together with people here tonight. That's the team that guys like Mike and I depend on to win for America. And so you want a team like what you're seeing tonight, elect a Republican in November.
Secretary Pompeo.
Let's see. No fuzzy-headedness. We can't love these institutions because they have fancy names. They are utilitarian institutions that need to be used in a way that deliver not only for the United States, but for their central charters, for what it is they were designed to do. If we can do that, if America doesn't lose its eye on that, then they will prove at least a modicum of utility for us as we move forward.
Modicum of utility. High hopes. I want to thank our co-chairs, our seminar members, the Nixon Foundation, and all of you for watching. We'll be back on May 7th. But that's it for tonight's Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security. I'm Mary Kissel. Good night.